Before we start tonight's episode, just a quick reminder. What we talk about here is about patterns, ideas, and the culture we're all living in, not about attacking individuals. Identity is personal, and everyone's experience is different. The goal of this conversation isn't to dismiss that, but to step back and look at how identity is being shaped, expressed, and sometimes influenced by the world around us. These conversations can feel close to home, especially when we're talking about something as personal as identity. But that's exactly why they matter. If something we say challenges you or makes you think, that's not an attack. It's part of the culture check. Because identity shouldn't just be something we repeat. It should be something we understand.
Let me ask you something. If I asked you who you are, what would you say? Would you tell me your name, your job, your beliefs, your background, or would you start with a label? And because that's something that's changed over time, not all at once, but gradually. People don't just describe themselves anymore. They define themselves. And more often than not, those definitions are condensed into a few words. A category, a label, something that can be quickly understood, quickly communicated, and just as quickly recognized by other people. And again, I'm not saying that's wrong. Labels can help people find community. They can help people express things that used to be harder to put into words. They can even give people a sense of belonging in a world that sometimes feels disconnected. But there's a flip side to that, because when identity becomes something we declare publicly, it can also become something we feel the need to defend. And when something becomes tied to who you are, disagreement doesn't feel like disagreement anymore. Like it feels personal, it feels like an attack. And that's where things start to shift. Because instead of exchanging ideas, people start protecting identities. Instead of asking questions, people start drawing lines. And instead of discovering who they are over time, they feel pressure to define it up front. So the question tonight isn't whether identity matters, it's this. When did identity become something we announce instead of something we discover? This is Friday's Culture Check, and tonight we're asking, who are you without the labels? All right, let's bring in the crew, because if we're going to talk about identity, how people define themselves, how they present themselves, and why it feels like everything has to be labeled now, this is going to be one of those conversations where everyone's coming in with a different angle. It's Friday, which means the takes are a little sharper, the conversations go a little deeper, and we're not here to shout each other down. We're here to actually unpack what's going on. First up is Brian. If there's a cultural shift that looks like people replacing individuality with labels or turning identity into something rigid instead of something lived, he's going to go right at it. Brian brings that MAGA Fire Friday energy, and tonight he's looking at whether we've created a culture where people feel the need to define themselves up front instead of building who they are over time. Rachel's here as well, bringing the balance and the perspective that keeps this from going off the rails. Rachel looks at identity from a human side, how people use labels to find connection, to understand themselves, and to communicate experiences that aren't always easy to explain. She's here to remind us that there's usually more nuance behind these trends than we give them credit for. Daniel is in the building, which means we're going to hear about systems, incentives, and patterns. If identity is becoming more visible and more structured, his question is going to be why, what's driving it, who benefits from it, and whether the environment we're in is encouraging people to define themselves in certain ways. And Skylar is back, bringing the perspective that challenges this conversation from the other side. She's going to push back on the idea that identity expression is a problem at all, and instead argue that it can be empowering, clarifying, and necessary in a world where people are trying to understand themselves and be understood. And then there's me. I'm not here to referee. I'm here to ask the uncomfortable questions and see where this conversation actually goes. It's Friday, it's Culture Check. Let's get into it. It feels like everywhere you look now, identity is front and center. Social media bios, introductions, conversations. People are defining themselves quickly, clearly, and often publicly. A few words, a few labels, a few categories that are meant to tell the world who you are before anything else even gets said. And again, there's a reason for that. Labels can help people find community. They can help people explain experiences that aren't always obvious. They can make a complicated world feel a little more organized. There's real value in being able to say, this is who I am, and have someone else understand it right away. But there's also a shift happening underneath that, because when identity becomes something you declare up front, it can also become something you feel responsible for maintaining. It becomes more fixed, more visible, and sometimes more tied to how other people respond to it. And that's where things start to change, because instead of identity being something that evolves over time, something you discover through experience, it can start to feel like something you have to define early and defend often. So let's start there. Brian, I'll come to you first. When did identity become something people feel like they have to announce instead of something they grow into over time?
I think it started when everything moved online and people felt like they needed a quick way to explain themselves. When you're dealing with profiles, bios, and short attention spans, people condense who they are into something that can be understood instantly. And again, on the surface, that makes sense. It's efficient, it helps people connect faster. But the problem is, people are more complex than a few labels. And when you start defining yourself primarily through categories, you risk locking yourself into something that doesn't leave a lot of room to grow. Life changes you, experiences change you, but if your identity is tied to something you've already declared publicly, there can be pressure to stay consistent with that version of yourself. And that's where it gets tricky. Because instead of evolving naturally, people can start managing their identity like it's something that has to stay aligned with how they've already presented it.
Yeah, and that's where I think this starts to shift a little. Because once identity becomes something you're managing instead of something you're just living, it changes how you move. You start thinking about consistency. You start thinking about how you're perceived. And even if it's not intentional, there's a layer of pressure there, pressure to stay aligned with how you've already defined yourself instead of just evolving naturally. And I think that's the part people don't always notice. It's not that labels are bad, it's that they can quietly become something you feel like you have to protect. So let me ask you this, Skylar. Is this really a problem like Brian's saying? Or is this actually a good thing? People finally having the ability to define themselves on their own terms instead of being defined by everyone else.
I think it's more of a gain than a loss, honestly. Like, for a long time, people didn't have the language or the space to describe who they were in ways that felt accurate to them. Now they do. Labels can give people clarity, they can help people find others who understand them, and they can create a sense of belonging that wasn't always accessible before. But I do understand what Brian and you are getting at. When identity becomes something public, it can start to feel like something that has to stay consistent, and that can create pressure, especially if someone is still figuring themselves out. Growth isn't always clean and it's not always linear. So, if someone feels like they've already defined themselves, it might make it harder to explore beyond that. So, I don't think the problem is identity expression. I think the challenge is leaving room for change. People should be able to define themselves, but they should also be able to evolve without feeling like they're contradicting who they were before.
Yeah. And that balance right there is probably the hardest part of this whole thing. Because on one hand, having the freedom to define yourself is a good thing. People should have that. But on the other hand, if that definition becomes something you feel locked into, then it stops being freedom and starts becoming a boundary. And I think that's where this gets complicated because the same thing that gives clarity can also limit growth if it becomes too rigid. Daniel, let me bring you in here. Is this just a natural cultural shift? Or are we seeing a system that actually encourages people to define themselves in very specific ways because it makes them easier to group, understand, and even influence?
I think there's definitely a system element to it. When people define themselves in clear, recognizable ways, it makes them easier to categorize. And once something is categorized, it becomes easier to target, to group, and to build communities around, whether that's for connection, content, or even marketing. Platforms thrive on clarity. The more clearly people define themselves, the easier it is to recommend content, suggest communities, and keep people engaged. So there's a subtle incentive for identity to become more visible and more structured over time. That doesn't mean identity is being controlled, but it does mean the environment encourages people to present themselves in ways that are easy to understand and easy to place within a system.
So it's not just expression, it's structure. Because the clearer you define yourself, the easier it is for the system to understand you. And once it understands you, it can feed you more of what aligns with that identity, more content, more communities, more reinforcement. And that's where it can start to loop. Rachel, let me bring you in to ground this. Is this identity shift something we should actually be concerned about, or is this just people trying to make sense of themselves in a world that's moving faster than ever?
I think it's more about awareness than concern. identity has always been part of how people understand themselves and relate to others. What's changed is the visibility and the speed at which identity is expressed and reinforced. Labels can be helpful, especially when they provide language for experiences that are hard to explain, but they're still just tools. The risk comes when people start to see those tools as fixed definitions rather than flexible ways to describe where they are at a given moment. So, the healthiest approach is to use identity as a guide, not a boundary. Something that helps you understand yourself but doesn't limit who you can become.
That might be the line right there. Not whether identity exists, but whether it's flexible or fixed. Because if identity becomes something rigid, something you feel like you have to defend or maintain, it can stop being something you grow into and start being something you're stuck inside. So maybe the real culture check question isn't just about labels. It's this: are we discovering who we are or deciding it too early? All right, let's take a quick break because if identity is becoming more defined, there's probably a system that benefits from that.
Tonight's episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by Label Me, the world's first all-in-one identity management platform. Still trying to figure out who you are? That sounds exhausting. With Label Me, you don't have to. Just choose from our wide range of pre-built identity packages, and we'll handle the rest. Feeling bold this week? Try our Evolving Thinker bundle. Want something more permanent? Upgrade to Locked Identity Pro, where your opinions, personality, and worldview are automatically synced across all platforms. No growth required. Features include instant bio generator so you never have to introduce yourself again. Auto response arguments for when someone disagrees with you. Weekly identity updates so you can stay current with the culture. And our premium offended mode, which alerts you anytime someone questions your perspective. Because why spend years discovering who you are when you can download it in seconds? Label Me. Be defined, stay consistent, never question anything again, and
All right, joking aside, let's take this one a step further. Because if identity is becoming something people define and defend, what happens when disagreement feels personal? Think about how fast conversations escalate now. It doesn't take much. A disagreement, a different opinion, a question that challenges something someone believes, and almost instantly it can turn from a conversation into something personal. Not always, but often enough that you notice it. And part of that makes sense. When beliefs are tied closely to identity, disagreement doesn't just feel like someone challenging an idea. It can feel like they're challenging you. And when that line gets blurred, things change. Because instead of debating ideas, people start defending themselves. Instead of listening, they start reacting. And instead of asking questions, they start drawing lines. So here's the question. Rachel, I'll start with you. Did we lose the ability to separate who we are from what we believe? Or is this just what happens when identity becomes more visible and more personal?
I don't think we've completely lost the ability to separate identity from belief, but I do think that line has become much thinner than it used to be. When people express themselves in more visible and immediate ways, especially online, their beliefs are often presented as part of who they are rather than just something they think. Over time, that creates a natural connection between the two. So when someone challenges a belief, it can feel like they're questioning something more personal, even if that wasn't the intention. And when that happens repeatedly, people can start to protect their beliefs in the same way they would protect their identity. It becomes less about exploring ideas and more about maintaining a sense of self. That doesn't mean people are incapable of separating the two, and it just means the environment they're in makes it harder to do. When everything is visible, immediate, and often public, the stakes feel higher, and people respond accordingly.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly where things start to shift in a big way. Because once beliefs become tied to identity, the whole tone of a conversation changes. It's no longer just, I disagree with that idea. It starts to feel like I'm being challenged. And when people feel challenged on that level, they don't lean in, they push back hard. And in my opinion, that's why so many conversations now go from 0 to 100 so fast. It's not always about the topic itself. It's about what that topic represents to the person. So instead of debating ideas, people end up defending themselves. And once it hits that point, real conversation kind of goes out the window. So let me bring you in here, Brian. Do you think this is making people more fragile when it comes to disagreement? Or is it just people taking what they believe more seriously than they used to?
I think it's making people more fragile, and I don't think we should be afraid to say that. Taking your beliefs seriously is one thing. That's a good thing. But not being able to handle someone disagreeing with you without taking it personally, that's different. That's where it starts to break down. Because strong beliefs should be able to stand up to pressure. If you really believe something, you should be able to explain it, defend it, and even question it without feeling like your identity is under attack. But what I see now is people shutting down the second there's pushback. Not engaging, not debating, just reacting. And that reaction usually comes from feeling personally challenged instead of intellectually challenged. And I think a big part of that is what we talked about earlier. When identity and belief get tied together, people stop seeing disagreement as part of growth. They start seeing it as something they need to block, avoid, or shut down. And that's where the fragility comes in. Not because people are weak, but because they haven't had to separate those two things.
Yeah, and I think that's where this gets uncomfortable because there's truth on both sides of it. On one hand, people should care about what they believe. But on the other hand, if caring turns into reacting every time someone challenges you, that's not strength and that's instability. And I think what's happening is people aren't being taught how to sit in disagreement anymore. Everything is so fast, so reactive, so public that the moment something feels off, the response is immediate instead of thoughtful. And over time, that trains people to react instead of reflect. So, Skylar, let me bring you in here. Is this actually fragility, like Brian's saying? Or is this just people being more aware of how words affect them and choosing not to tolerate things they disagree with?
I think there is a difference between fragility and boundaries, and sometimes those two things get blurred together. People today are more aware of how language, ideas, and conversations affect them. And in some cases, they're choosing not to engage with things that feel harmful or unproductive. That doesn't automatically mean they're fragile. It can also mean they're being intentional about where they put their energy and attention. But I will say this: when everything becomes something you avoid instead of something you engage with, that's where growth can stall. And discomfort has always been part of learning. If people never sit in conversations that challenge them, they don't get the opportunity to refine their thinking or strengthen their perspective. So while boundaries are important, there's also value in being able to stay in a conversation without immediately shutting it down.
Yeah, and I think that's the tension right there. Boundaries versus avoidance. Because setting boundaries is healthy, no doubt. But if every uncomfortable conversation gets labeled as something to avoid, then you lose the ability to actually work through differences. And I think that's happening more than people realize. And in my opinion, growth has always required some level of friction. You don't sharpen your thinking by staying in spaces where everyone agrees with you. You sharpen it by being challenged, by having to explain yourself, by hearing something you don't like and figuring out why. And if that process disappears, then yeah, people don't necessarily get weaker, but they definitely get less tested. So, Daniel, let me bring you in here. Is this tension we're seeing between disagreement and identity just a cultural shift? Or are the systems people are in actually amplifying conflict in a way that makes everything feel more personal than it used to?
I think the systems are absolutely amplifying it. Most platforms are built around engagement, and conflict is one of the fastest ways to drive engagement. When people react emotionally, they respond more quickly, more frequently, and more intensely. So the system naturally promotes content that triggers those reactions, whether it's outrage, agreement, or defensiveness. And when that content is constantly being pushed, it creates an environment where disagreement feels more aggressive than it actually is. People aren't just encountering opposing ideas, they're encountering them in their most amplified form. That makes it harder to separate the idea from the tone, and over time, it trains people to interpret disagreement as confrontation. So what you end up with is a feedback loop. The system promotes stronger reactions. Those reactions reinforce the perception that everything is more intense, and people respond accordingly. It's not that people suddenly became more sensitive, it's that the environment around them became more reactive.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense because if the environment is constantly turning everything up to a 10, then even normal disagreement starts to feel like conflict. And once everything feels like conflict, people stop approaching conversations with curiosity and start approaching them with defense. And I think that's where this all connects back to identity. Because if the system is amplifying everything and identity is tied closely to belief, then yeah, it's going to feel personal more often than not. And once it feels personal, people aren't debating anymore and they're protecting it. So maybe the real issue isn't just identity or fragility. Maybe it's the environment shaping how those things interact. Yeah. And I think that's really what stands out to me in all of this. It's not just that people disagree. uh, that's always been part of life. It's how quickly disagreement turns into something heavier, something personal, something that feels like it has to be defended instead of discussed. And when that becomes the default, conversations don't really go anywhere. They just escalate. And in my opinion, that's where the real shift has happened. It's not that people suddenly forgot how to think, it's that the environment around them is constantly pushing them to react instead of reflect. When everything is fast, loud, and amplified, it's a lot harder to slow down and separate "I disagree with that idea" from "I'm being attacked." And when that separation disappears, so does real conversation. Because real conversation requires space, it requires patience, it requires the ability to hear something you don't agree with and not immediately turn it into a line in the sand. And I think that's what's getting lost. Not intelligence, not passion, but the ability to sit in that middle ground where ideas can actually be explored instead of defended. So maybe the real culture check here isn't just about identity or even fragility. Maybe it's this: can we still disagree without taking it personally? All right, it's Friday. Let's lighten this up a little. Time for the lightning round. Because there are a few things happening right now that make you stop and go, wait, this is normal now? All right, let's lighten it up a bit. We've been talking about identity, labels, and why everything feels more personal than it used to. But now it's Friday, so we're going to bring it back with the lightning round. Three things that have become completely normal. But if you really stop and think about them, they're kind of wild. Quick reactions, no overthinking, just real takes. Let's go. First one, go look at social media bios today. Some of them are longer than actual resumes, lists of labels, beliefs, affiliations, identifiers, everything packed into a few lines like it's a full introduction. When did a bio become a full identity breakdown? Brian, go.
Yeah, this one's wild to me because a bio used to be simple. Name, maybe what you do, maybe something you're into. Done. Now it's like a full resume mixed with a personality profile mixed with a declaration of beliefs. And again, I get why it's happening. People want to be understood quickly. They want to signal where they stand. But at the same time, it feels like people are trying to explain everything about themselves up front instead of letting people figure it out over time. There's no discovery anymore. It's all laid out immediately, and sometimes that takes away from actually getting to know someone. And I think part of it goes back to what we've been talking about. Identity being something that's presented instead of lived. When everything is defined up front, there's less room for nuance, less room for growth, and honestly, less room for surprise.
I think some of that comes from people wanting to avoid being misunderstood. When communication is mostly happening online, context gets lost easily. Uh, so people try to include more information up front to make sure they're being seen accurately. And in some cases, that can actually be helpful. It can set expectations, create clarity, and help people find others who share similar perspectives. But I do think there's a trade off. When everything is defined right away, it can make interactions feel more rigid, like you're meeting a description instead of a person.
There's also a system incentive behind it. The more clearly someone defines themselves, the easier it is for platforms to categorize them and connect them with specific content and communities. So the environment subtly encourages people to be more explicit about who they are. Over time, that turns into a norm. People see others doing it, they follow suit, and suddenly it becomes expected. Not because anyone told them to, but because that's how the system works best.
And again, it comes back to balance. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be understood, but identity isn't something that can be fully captured in a few lines of text. It's something that unfolds over time through interaction, experience, and conversation. So while bios can offer a snapshot, they shouldn't replace the process of actually getting to know someone. That's where real understanding happens.
All right, round two. People introducing themselves with labels first. Before anything else, before personality, before story, it starts with identity categories. When did that become the opening line? Like, Skylar, go.
I think for a lot of people, it's about context and clarity. Labels can quickly communicate aspects of someone's experience that might otherwise take a long time to explain. In certain spaces, that kind of shorthand helps people connect faster and understand each other better. But I do think there is a downside if it becomes the primary way people introduce themselves. Because identity is more than any single label or category. When that becomes the first and most important thing people lead with, it can overshadow everything else that makes someone who they are.
Yeah, and that's exactly my issue with it. When the first thing out of your mouth is a label, it kind of sets the tone for everything that follows. It tells people, this is how I want to be seen, before they even get to know you. And I think that limits people more than they realize. Because instead of being known for your actions, your character, your personality, you're being known for a category. And categories don't tell the full story.
There's also a signaling component. Labels communicate alignment, where someone stands, what groups they belong to, what perspectives they might hold. In environments where people are trying to quickly assess similarity or difference, that kind of signaling becomes more common, but like everything else we've talked about, it can become overused. When labels move from being informative to being defining, they start to shape interactions before they even begin.
And that's where awareness matters again. Labels can be helpful, but they're only one part of a much larger picture. When people rely on them too heavily, they can unintentionally reduce themselves, and others to something smaller than they actually are. So it's not about removing labels entirely. It's about remembering they're a starting point, not the full story.
Final one. People getting canceled, or at least heavily criticized, for disagreeing. Not for doing something extreme, just for having a different opinion. When did disagreement become something that could cost you everything? Daniel, go.
I think this ties directly into visibility and amplification. When opinions are shared publicly and reach large audiences, the reaction to those opinions also becomes public and amplified. That creates a dynamic where disagreement isn't just between two people. It becomes a broader social response. And when that response builds momentum, it can escalate quickly. What might have been a simple disagreement in a private setting can turn into a larger issue when it's visible to thousands of people. The scale changes the impact.
Yeah, and that's where I think things have gone too far. Disagreement is supposed to be part of a healthy society. You're not going to agree with everyone. That's normal. But when people start getting shut down or pushed out just for having a different opinion, that's a problem. Because what that does is it discourages people from speaking at all. They'd rather stay quiet than deal with the backlash. And when people stop speaking honestly, you don't get better conversations, you just get safer ones.
I think accountability and overreaction get mixed together in this conversation. There are situations where people should be held accountable for what they say, especially if it's harmful, but not every disagreement falls into that category. Like when everything is treated with the same level of intensity, it becomes harder to distinguish between real issues and normal differences in perspective. And that can create an environment where people feel like they're always one step away from saying the wrong thing.
Exactly. A healthy culture needs space for disagreement, discussion, and even mistakes. That's how ideas evolve. When disagreement is immediately escalated to something more severe, it limits that process. So again, it comes back to balance. Being able to address real issues while still allowing room for conversation and differing viewpoints.
Long bios, label first introductions, and disagreement turning into something bigger than it used to be. None of it is random. It all ties back to the same thing, how we define ourselves and how we respond when that definition gets challenged. All right, before we wrap this up, let's take a quick look at the merch.
All right, before we wrap things up tonight, let's take a quick second to talk about the Data and Dissonance merch store. If you've been listening to the show and you like what we're building here, real conversations, different perspectives, and actually taking a step back to think instead of just react. This is a way to support that and represent it at the same time. We've got hoodies, tees, trucker hats, mugs, bumper stickers, all built around the idea of thinking for yourself and not just going along with whatever the loudest voice in the room is saying. And of course, the coffee lineup is still there. High Lakes, the light roast, Rock Creek, the medium roast, and Bitter Root, the dark French roast. Strong, bold, and probably exactly what you need after scrolling through the internet for 5 minutes. If you want to check it out, head over to data-and-dissonance.printify.me/. Support the show, rep the message, and keep the conversation going.
You know, identity has always mattered. People have always tried to understand who they are, where they fit, what they believe. That part isn't new. What's new is how quickly we feel like we need to define it, and how publicly we feel like we need to present it. It's no longer just something you figure out over time. It's something you're expected to explain, summarize, and sometimes defend almost immediately. And I think that's where things start to shift in a subtle way. Because when identity becomes something you have to declare, it can also become something you feel like you have to protect. And once you start protecting it, you start reacting to anything that feels like it challenges it. Not because you're weak, not because you're fragile, but because it feels personal. And when things feel personal, people don't slow down and think. They respond. And in my opinion, that's the real culture check tonight. It's not about whether identity is important. It is. It's about whether we're giving ourselves enough space to grow beyond the labels we choose in the moment. Because who you are at one point in your life isn't who you're going to be forever. And if you lock yourself into something too early, you might miss who you're actually becoming. Because identity at its best isn't something you announce. It's something you discover. It changes, it evolves, it gets shaped by experience, by challenge, by time. And the moment it becomes something rigid, something you feel like you can't question or step outside of, that's the moment it stops helping you and starts limiting you. So maybe the real question isn't just who are you? Maybe it's, are you still allowing yourself to find out? That's this week's Culture Check. We'll see you next time. Remember to speak truth. Stir thought.
Tonight's episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by the stories and the sound behind everything we're building here. If you've been listening to this show and you enjoy conversations about identity, conviction, truth, and what it means to stand firm in a world that's constantly shifting, then you'll want to check out the Caleb Rourke thriller series. It starts with the Covenant Protocol, followed by the Prophet Directive, and continues with Black Echo Rising, all available now on Amazon. These aren't just fast-paced thrillers. They're stories about navigating pressure, about holding on to who you are when everything around you is trying to define you differently, and about making decisions when the stakes are high and the lines aren't always clear. If you like stories with action, tension, and something deeper underneath, this series was built for you. And if music is more your lane, the Data and Dissonance music catalog is available on all major streaming platforms. The album Uncaged, raw, reflective, and rooted in real-life struggle, written from experience, from hardship, and from the kind of moments that shape who you become. The album Four Wheelers and Hallelujah, country-driven, grounded in faith, freedom, and the everyday people who keep things moving forward. And the track Stand Tall Charlie, a reminder of resilience, conviction, and standing firm when it matters most. Books for the mind, music for the road, and a show built to make you think. We'll see you next episode.